Name the best British general of the Second World War. Take a moment. Think about it. If you said Montgomery, I understand. He beat Rommel at El Alamein. He planned the ground campaign for D-Day. He wore the black beret, courted the cameras, and made absolutely certain that every newspaper in the English-speaking world knew his name. Montgomery is the answer you were taught. Montgomery is the answer on the bookshelf. Montgomery is the answer in every documentary the BBC has ever made about the war. That answer is wrong. The man I want to talk about today inherited the worst defeat in British military history, a 1,000-mile retreat through jungle and monsoon that left his army broken, sick, and abandoned by London. He rebuilt that army from scratch. He turned it into the largest single army Britain ever fielded. 606,000 men drawn from more nations, more faiths, and more languages than any force a British general had ever commanded. And then he destroyed an entire Japanese army group in what multiple historians have called the greatest land campaign of the entire war. His troops called him Uncle Bill. Mountbatten called him the finest general the Second World War produced. Frank McLynn, the military historian, put it plainly, Montgomery was a military talent. This man was a military genius. His name was William Slim. And the reason you have never heard of him tells you more about how the British class system manufactures military fame than any book you will read this year. Walk into any bookshop with a military history section. Count the books on Montgomery. Count the books on Churchill's generals. Count the books on Rommel, on Patton, on Eisenhower. Now look for William Slim. If you find anything at all, it will be one book, possibly two, tucked at the back of the shelf behind men whose battlefield records do not come close to his. In 1945, the British government released a documentary called Burma Victory. It was supposed to tell the story of the campaign Slim had just won. The film devoted its first 50 minutes to Mountbatten, to Wingate, to Stilwell, to Leese. Slim appeared in the final 10 minutes. Veterans of the 14th Army were furious. They had fought the longest, hardest campaign of the war against an enemy who did not surrender, in terrain that killed more men through disease than through bullets. And their general was an afterthought in his own film. Churchill barely mentioned him in his war memoirs. The Prime Minister reportedly said he could have no confidence in a general with a name like Slim. That is not a joke. That is the system telling you exactly how it works, and you still do not know who he is. William Joseph Slim was born on the 6th of August, 1891, in Bristol, the son of John Slim, a wholesale ironmonger whose business would later fail. The family moved to Birmingham. There was only enough money to send one son to university, and it was not William. Between 1910 and 1914, the future Field Marshal taught at a primary school in a Birmingham slum and worked as a clerk at Stewart's and Lloyd's, a metal tube manufacturer. That matters. Montgomery was the son of a bishop. Slim was the son of a failed metal worker. Montgomery went to Sandhurst. Slim could not afford Sandhurst. He joined the Birmingham University Officers Training Corps, a route into the army that the officer class considered barely acceptable, and was commissioned as a temporary second lieutenant in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment on the 22nd of August 1914. By a coincidence that history seems to have enjoyed, the Royal Warwickshire Regiment was also Montgomery's regiment. They entered the army through the same door. One of them could afford the dining room on the other side, the other could not. Slim went to Gallipoli in 1915. He led bayonet charges at Cape Helles. He was shot through the shoulder and evacuated. Doctors thought he would lose the use of his left arm. He fought his way back to fitness. He went to Mesopotamia in 1916. He won the Military Cross for bravery in the advance on Baghdad. He was wounded again in 1917. After the war, he could not afford the mess bills of a British regiment, so he transferred to the Indian Army and joined the 6th Gurkha Rifles. That transfer shaped everything that followed. In the Indian Army, Slim learned to lead men across lines of language, culture, religion, and caste. He learned that leadership is not about where you went to school. It is about whether the man next to you believes you will not waste his life. He spent the interwar years excelling at the Staff College in Quetta, teaching at the Staff College in Camberley, attending the Imperial Defence College, and writing short fiction under the pen name Anthony Mills to supplement his modest pay. He married Aileen Robertson in 1926. He was promoted slowly but steadily. He was given command of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles in 1938. He was good at his job. Nobody important noticed. Then came the war. In 1940, Slim commanded the 10th Indian Infantry Brigade in East Africa against the Italians. He captured Gallabat but failed to push on to Metemmah, a decision he would later write about with brutal honesty. When 2 courses of action were open to me, he said, I had not chosen, as a good commander should, the bolder. I had taken counsel of my fears. That sentence tells you something critical about the man. Generals do not admit to cowardice. Slim did. In his very first action of the war, before anyone was watching, before anyone would have cared, he told the truth about himself. He was wounded a 3rd time in early 1941, this time by an Italian aircraft, and sent his mother a telegram that tells you everything about his character. Bullet Bottom Better Bill. Promoted to acting Major General in May 1941, he led the 10th Indian Division through the Anglo-Iraqi War, the Syria-Lebanon campaign, and the invasion of Persia. In March 1942, he was sent to Burma to command the 1st Burma Corps. The situation was already catastrophic. Rangoon had fallen. The Japanese had air superiority, jungle superiority, and the momentum of total victory. Slim commanded roughly 42,000 men across 2 divisions, the 17th Indian and the 1st Burma. What followed was the longest retreat in the history of the British Army. 1,000 miles over 100 days, from the Irrawaddy to the Indian border, losing 13,000 men and most of their equipment. By the time they crossed into India, the Corps was down to 28 of its original 150 field guns. Slim did not cause that disaster. The responsibility lay with the strategic neglect of Burma, contradictory orders from above, and the total absence of air cover. But he owned the defeat. He watched the survivors march past him into India, and he wrote this. They might look like scarecrows, but they looked like soldiers too. That is not a man who was making excuses. That is a man who was already planning the return. In October 1943, Slim took command of the newly formed 14th Army. The army he inherited was beaten, sick, and forgotten. The illness rate was staggering. In 1943, the 14th Army's sickness rate stood at roughly 1,200 per 1,000 men per year. That means every soldier in the army statistically was hospitalized more than once. Slim himself cited a figure of 84% of his total strength falling sick annually. Malaria was not a secondary problem. Malaria was the primary enemy. Slim's response was simple and ruthless. Every man took mepicrine, the anti-malarial drug, every day. If the men did not take it, the company commander was responsible. If the company commander failed, the battalion commander was responsible. And if the battalion commander failed, Slim sacked him. In his own words, I sacked the commander. I only had to sack 3. By then the rest had got my meaning. By 1945, the malaria rate among combat troops had dropped to under 5%. The overall hospitalization rate for malaria fell to 1/6 of its peak. 6 deaths from 14,000 cases. That is not a battle. That is an administrative revolution, and it is as important as any tactical victory in the entire campaign. He rebuilt morale by touring every unit he could reach, speaking plainly, answering questions honestly, and refusing to pretend that Burma was anything other than what it was, the hardest, least glamorous, most neglected theatre of the war. His men called themselves the Forgotten Army. Slim did not deny it. He told them they were forgotten, and then he told them they were going to win anyway. He identified 3 foundations of morale. Spiritual, the men must believe in the cause. Intellectual, the men must believe the objective is achievable. Material, the men must believe they will be properly equipped and properly led. He worked on all 3 simultaneously. The army he was building was unlike anything the British had ever assembled. By late 1944, the 14th Army had 12 divisions. 2 were British, 7 were Indian, drawn from Hindu, Sikh, Muslim and other communities. 3 were African, the 81st and 82nd West African Divisions and the 11th East African Division. Gurkha battalions from Nepal served throughout. By 1945, Robert Lyman gives the precise figure: the 14th Army numbered 606,000 men under command. It was the largest single army Britain had ever fielded, and at that moment, the largest army in the world. Slim commanded this force across lines of language, faith, caste, and continent. Montgomery never faced anything like that challenge. He developed the box doctrine. When the Japanese surrounded a unit, the old response was to retreat. Slim ordered his men to stand fast, form a defensive box, and call for air supply. The surrounded garrison would hold. The Japanese, who carried almost no supplies of their own, would starve. Slim proved it at the Battle of the Admin Box in Arakan in February 1944, where rear echelon troops held out under air resupply and inflicted a sharp Japanese defeat. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle was broken. Slim had broken it. In March 1944, the Japanese 15th Army under Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation U-Go, the invasion of India. Roughly 85,000 Japanese troops with an Indian National Army contingent crossed the Chindwin River in 3 divisions, the 15th, the 31st, and the 33rd, aiming to seize the Imphal Plain and cut the road at Kohima. Mutaguchi brought roughly 3 weeks of rations. He expected a quick victory. He did not get one. Slim and his 4th Corps commander, Geoffrey Scoones, planned to draw the Japanese onto the Imphal Plain, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. I want to be honest here because this channel is built on honesty. Slim and Scoones misjudged the timing and the weight of the Japanese attack. They underestimated the threat to Kohima in particular. The delaying action of the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade at Sangshak and the Assam Regiment brought critical days that Slim had not expected to need. That is a legitimate criticism of his generalship, and I'm not going to bury it. But what Slim did next was extraordinary. He airlifted the 5th Indian Division from Arakan to Imphal in 11 days. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces delivered nearly 19,000 tons of supplies and 12,000 men into the Imphal Plain and evacuated 13,000 casualties by air. The entire battle was sustained from the sky. At Kohima, a garrison of roughly 2,500 men built around the 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment held against the 13,000-strong Japanese 31st Division. The fighting took place in and around the District Commissioner's tennis court. Combat at point-blank range across the width of a lawn tennis court. Men threw grenades at each other over the net. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened. The garrison held for 16 days before the 2nd Division relieved them, and the battle for the ridge continued for another 2 months. Kohima and Imphal together broke the back of the Japanese 15th Army. Mutaguchi refused to retreat. He sacked all 3 of his divisional commanders. Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato of the 31st Division defied orders and withdrew from Kohima at the end of May to save his starving men, an act of open insubordination that was itself an indictment of the entire operation. Mutaguchi finally called off Operation U-Go on the 3rd of July 1944. By then his army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The retreat to the Chindwin was a death march. Starving, diseased and wounded Japanese soldiers crawled along jungle tracks that the survivors called the Road of Bones. The results are devastating to read. The Japanese suffered 60,643 casualties, including 13,376 dead. Most of those losses came from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Of the frontline troops who crossed the Chindwin, roughly 30,000 were killed. Only about 600 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. Allied losses were approximately 17,000. The Imperial War Museum describes Imphal and Kohima as the greatest defeat ever inflicted on the Japanese army to that point. The Japanese military's own assessment agrees. They consider it their worst defeat of the war, and you still have not heard of him. In January 1945, Slim faced a new problem. The Japanese commander in Burma, Lieutenant General Hitaro Kimura, was smarter than Mutaguchi. Kimura pulled his forces behind the Irrawaddy River rather than fight on the Shwibo Plain where Slim wanted him. Slim needed a new plan. He devised one that military historians have studied ever since. The plan was called Operation Extended Capital, and it was, in Robert Lyman's words, Slims and Slims alone. The 33rd Corps would attack openly toward Mandalay, fixing Kimura's attention on the obvious prize. Meanwhile, the 4th Corps would disappear. Slim switched it secretly from his left flank to his right, sending it south down the Gangor Valley under radio silence, behind a dummy corps headquarters broadcasting fake traffic near Sitang. The 4th Corps would cross the Irrawaddy near Pakoku, then drive an armoured strike force, the 17th Indian Division, and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade, 75 miles deep into the Japanese rear to seize the supply and communications hub at Meiktila. The Irrawaddy is one of the great rivers of the world. Slim's engineers built 541 rivercraft from improvised materials. The crossings began on the 13th and 14th of February, 1945. The deception worked completely. Kimura was looking at Mandalay when the 17th Indian Division and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade burst out of the bridgehead at Nyangu and drove 75 miles into his rear. Meiktila fell around the 3rd of March after a rapid armoured thrust that unhinged the entire Japanese defensive position in central Burma. The Japanese counterattacked ferociously, throwing everything they had at the town, but the 17th Indian Division held. Meanwhile, Mandalay fell to the 33rd Corps on the 20th of March. Kimura's front was broken in 2 places and he could not fix either one. Slim was clear about what he was doing. It was not Mandalay or Meiktila that we were after, he said, but the Japanese army. He was not capturing territory, he was destroying an army. And he did. The race to Rangoon followed. On the 1st of May, a composite Gurkha parachute battalion dropped on Elephant Point at the mouth of the Rangoon River. The 26th Indian Division landed by sea on the 2nd of May. Kimura had already begun evacuating Rangoon, and Royal Air Force aircrew spotted the words "Japs Gone" painted on a jail roof by Allied prisoners of war. The monsoon broke the same day, 2 weeks early. Rangoon was taken. Across the full Burma campaign, Slim's 14th Army inflicted what the United States Army War College has described as the greatest land defeat ever sustained by the Japanese Army. He did it at the lowest priority for resources of any British command. He did it with an army the establishment had written off. He did it in terrain that killed more men through disease than through combat. Now I have to do the harder part of this story, because this channel is not in the business of uncritical hero worship, and if I skip the moral complexity, you should stop trusting me. Slim fought a brutal war against a brutal enemy. The Japanese army committed systematic atrocities throughout the Burma campaign, executing prisoners, using forced labour, and presiding over an occupation that killed between 170,000 and 250,000 Burmese civilians. The broader estimates of total Burmese civilian deaths run as high as 1 million. The refugee exodus of 1942 alone killed tens of thousands. Burma was a catastrophe for its people, and the fact that the Japanese bore the primary responsibility does not make the story simple. The 14th Army was a colonial army. Indian, Gurkha, West African, and East African soldiers made up the overwhelming majority of its strength. These men fought for the British Empire at precisely the moment when India was debating its own independence. The Indian National Army, fighting alongside the Japanese, was made up of Indian prisoners of war who had decided that the Empire was the enemy, not Japan. That is not a comfortable fact for a story about British military genius, and I am not going to pretend it is not there. Slim treated his colonial troops with a respect that was, by the standards of his time, remarkable. His soldiers, Indian and African and Gurkha, appear throughout defeat into victory not as supporting characters, but as the army itself. He understood that leadership across lines of language, culture, and faith required something that the British class system was not designed to produce: genuine respect for men who did not look like you and did not come from your world. But genuine respect within a colonial framework is still a colonial framework. Both things are true. The campaign itself, while fought with greater discipline than many Pacific operations, was not without the brutality common to the war against Japan. Surrender rates on both sides were extraordinarily low. The near-zero Japanese prisoner count at Imphal, roughly 600 from 85,000, reflected Japanese indoctrination, but it also reflected battlefield realities that neither side discussed openly after the war. I think Slim was an honourable man fighting a dishonourable war in an imperial system he served without seriously questioning. I think his treatment of his soldiers, regardless of race, was better than the system he operated within. I think both of those things are true at the same time. So why do you not know his name? The question is more interesting than the man, and I mean that as a compliment to the question. The first reason is geography. Burma was, in Churchill's mind, and in London's strategic calculations, a sideshow. The real war was in Europe. The resources, the war correspondence, the cameras, and the political attention were all pointed at Normandy, at Italy, at the advance into Germany. The 14th Army called itself the Forgotten Army because it was. The phrase was reportedly coined by a war correspondent, and the men adopted it because it was true. The second reason is media. Montgomery understood something that Slim either did not understand or refused to practice. Montgomery managed the press. He cultivated journalists, arranged photo opportunities, wore the distinctive beret, and built a personal brand that was, by 1944, as recognizable as Churchill's cigar. Slim did none of that. A Fleet Street editor named Frank Owen observed that Slim does not court popularity, and he hates publicity, but he inspires trust. Trust does not sell newspapers. Celebrity does. The third reason is class, and this is the one that should make your blood boil. Slim was not from the officer class. He was a scholarship boy, a former schoolteacher, an Indian Army man in a culture that treated the Indian Army as the second 11. The British military establishment of the 1940s still ran on connections, on school ties, on who your father was and which regiment he had served in. The historian Robert Lyman notes that even after his greatest victories, Slim was exposed to upper-class English snobbery and distrust, shown even by Winston Churchill. Montgomery was the son of a bishop. Slim was the son of a failed ironmonger. The British establishment knew the difference, and it allocated fame accordingly. When the war ended, the generals who got the public honours, the media profiles, and the invitations to Downing Street were overwhelmingly the men who came from the right families and commanded in the right theatre. Slim came from the wrong family and commanded in the wrong theatre. The fourth reason is the end of empire. The Burma campaign was fought predominantly by Indian, Gurkha and African troops in a colonial theatre that Britain was about to lose. After 1947, when India became independent, the entire Burma campaign became an awkward memory. A story about colonial soldiers fighting under the British flag in a country that no longer wanted either of them there. The European War could be remembered as a noble crusade. The Burma War was harder to fit into that narrative. The fifth reason is credit. Mountbatten, as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, sat above Slim in the chain of command. Wingate, the Chindit commander, was Churchill's favourite and generated enormous press coverage, despite commanding a fraction of the forces Slim commanded. Stilwell, the American, attracted American media attention. The credit for the Burma campaign was diffused across half a dozen names, none of whom actually fought the decisive battles. The man who did fight them was the one name the system could most easily forget, and here is the part that should make you angry. In May 1945, after Slim had won the campaign, Lieutenant General Sir Oliver Leese, a Montgomery protégé sent out to command Allied land forces Southeast Asia, tried to sack him. Leese proposed to replace Slim with Philip Christison for the Malaya operation, and shunt Slim sideways to mop up operations. Slim told his staff he had been sacked. Word spread through the 14th Army. Senior officers threatened mass resignations. Alan Brooke and Mountbatten intervened. Slim was reinstated. Leese was removed. Slim showed his campaign dispatches to a fellow general on an aircraft and said, "You would not think they would sack a chap for doing that, would you?" 3 years later, the irony completed itself. In late 1948, Prime Minister Clement Attlee needed a new chief of the Imperial General Staff. Montgomery proposed his own candidate, John Crocker. Attlee rejected Crocker and recalled Slim from retirement. When Montgomery protested that he had already promised Crocker the job, Attlee reportedly replied, "You had better untell him." William Slim became the first Indian Army officer to serve as Chief of the Imperial General Staff, replacing the very man whose celebrity had eclipsed him for the entire war. He was promoted to Field Marshal on the 4th of January 1949. He later served as Governor-General of Australia from 1953 to 1960, a tenure so popular that Prime Minister Robert Menzies praised his cogency, dry humour, and directness. A famous story from that period. Slim walked into an Outback bar in full ceremonial dress. An astonished local looked at him and said one word, "Christ." Slim replied, "No, the Governor-General." He was created Viscount Slim in 1960 and made a Knight of the Garter in 1959. He died on the 14th of December 1970 and was buried in the grounds of St Andrew's Church at the National Memorial Arboretum. The Slim Officers' Mess at Sandhurst is named after him. Defeat into Victory remains on the reading list at the United States Army Command and General Staff College. Let me give you my verdict, because this channel is built on verdicts. I believe William Slim was the best British general of the Second World War and one of the finest commanders in the history of the British Army. I am not alone in that assessment. Mountbatten called him the finest general the war produced. Max Hastings called him Britain's ablest field commander of the war. Robert Lyman has called him Britain's greatest general. In 2011, the National Army Museum held a public debate on the question of Britain's greatest general. Slim tied with the Duke of Wellington. Slim's case was argued by Lyman, Wellington's by Peter Snow. They tied. I want to put one comparison in front of you and then leave it alone. Montgomery's one attempt at a war of movement, Operation Market Garden, the advance through Arnhem, was a signal and embarrassing failure. That is Frank McClinn's judgment, not mine alone. Slim conducted a war of movement across the most difficult terrain on earth, with the lowest priority for resources, commanding the most diverse multinational force any British general had ever led, and he did not fail. Montgomery had the press. Slim had the record. The press writes the history. The record gathers dust. He was a schoolteacher from Birmingham who could not afford Sandhurst. He was wounded 3 times across 2 wars. He commanded an army of Indian and Gurkha and African and British soldiers who trusted him because he never lied to them and never wasted their lives. He won the Military Cross for valour. He wrote one of the finest military memoirs ever published, a book called Defeat into Victory that has never gone out of print, and in the last line of that book he gave the credit away. To the soldiers of the many races who, in the comradeship of the 14th Army, did go on, belongs the true glory of achievement. It was they who turned defeat into victory. George MacDonald Fraser, a 19-year-old lance corporal who fought under Slim at Mictila, left the description that captures the man better than anything else. "I see him clear," he wrote, "with that robber baron face under the Gurkha hat, and his carbine slung, looking like a rather scruffy private with a general's tabs," which of course is what he was. Fraser added this: "British soldiers do not love their commanders, much less worship them. 14th Army trusted Slim and thought of him as one of themselves. No general ever did more with less. In every way he was one of the great captains. He was good at his job. The job was fought for an empire that was ending, in a country that did not ask for the war, with men who deserved more recognition than history gave them. Both things are true. The man who won the greatest land campaign of the war did not court the cameras. The man who courted the cameras got the statue on Whitehall, and you were never taught the difference. If your family served in the 14th Army, in Burma, in India, in the Gurkhas, in the West African or East African divisions, I want to hear about it. Those stories are disappearing. They matter more than you think. Drop them in the comments. That is the reality behind the legend. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.